In this chapter, we're going to focus on working with files and directories in PHP. I want you to set everything we've been doing with object-oriented programming aside. We're going to be focusing on the file system for now, and we're going to be coming back to the object-oriented later when we talk about uploading files to the file system. But first, we have some basics that we need to take care of. Now, because we're going to be setting all of that object-oriented programming aside, let's close up our photo gallery and let's go back to the B2B sandbox where we were working earlier. And let's create ourselves a new file in there. Let's call it file basics.php. Make sure you put it in your B2B sandbox. And this will be the file where we can take a look at some of the basics of working with files. Now, the most important thing of working with files and the file system in PHP is the magic constant file, underscore, and then all capitals, file, underscore. I'll go ahead and put a BR tag at the end of this. Let's go ahead and save this file, and let's open up a new browser window. We're going to want to make sure that we go back to our sandbox and load up file basics.php. And look what it gave me when it echoed back the value of that magic constant file. It gave me the full path to get to that file. So it illustrates that it knows exactly where that file is located, the file that we're loading up. So underscore file is this file that's being loaded. Now, there's another magic constant that goes along with it, which is line. And let's load that up, and you'll see that it comes back and it says 4. Now that it becomes obvious then that line tells you what line we're looking at. We can see here it's numbered 4. One caveat with this is be careful once you include files, because then the line number may not be what you expect if we have other files that have been included, if we're calling functions inside of functions. So just be careful about that with line number and be aware that it may not be quite what you expect. Now, if we want to get the directory information about the file that we're working in, we can do that by calling a function on it. dir name underscore file. We'll pass that in, and it will be able to simply parse out the directory name from the file name. I want to also at the same time show you that there's another version of this, which is only in PHP 5.3, and that's simply to say dir, and that's the same thing as a magic constant that will return the directory name. Now you'll see mine's a different color because I'm not running 5.3 yet. It hasn't been released at the time that I'm recording it. This does the exact same thing. They're equivalent. So for now you can use this, in the future you can use this, but you also can take advantage of this once you're using 5.3. So let's just bring those up and try them. You'll see it didn't work for me. If you are running on 5.3, you probably will see the same information there a second time. So now that we understand how to reference the file that we're in and the directory in, we're ready to start taking a look at a few functions. The first of these is simply file exists. Does the file exist? And if it does, return yes or no. I'm just using a simple ternary operator here to return yes or no. Of course, the file that we're in does exist. That's not very interesting, but we could also say something more interesting like the directory name of this file when added to /basic.html. Does that exist? Now notice we're building up a path here. We found the directory name, and then from there, we added basic.html. So here's the directory name, B2B sandbox. It's just a string, and to that, we'll put /basic.html. Does that exist? Yes, both of them exist, the file that we're in and basic.html. Now, the quirky thing about file exists is that it also works on just directories. Does the directory exist is the same thing as file exists. So don't be confused because it says file. What it really means is this part of the file system. Does it exist? So if we try that on the directory name, it also returns true. It does exist. Instead, if we want to find out if something actually is a file or not, we need to call a different method, which is file. So we can call that both on the basic.html page and on the directory, and we'll see what we get back. Yes and no. And of course, the corollary to that is being able to ask not just is it a file, but is it a directory? Is dir. So is this a directory? Well, no, it's not. But this should be a directory. So we'll just do both of those and check. Sure enough, no and yes are the answers that come back. And just for the sake of completeness, I want to show you that you also can simply reference the directory that this file is in by calling ... Remember how to use ... when we were navigating the file system from the command line? It works here as well. So is ... a directory? And it figures out, yes, that's what we're talking about. It is the directory that this file is in. So that also works as well. Now, these are going to make up the fundamental building blocks for working with the file system, because before we write a file, for example, we'll want to check and make sure that the file doesn't already exist. Or after we've written a file, we'll want to make sure that it does exist. We might want to check that a file exists before we try and read it, or make sure that it is a file and not a directory before we try and read it. So these are going to be the toolbox that we're going to be using going forward. So get used to them, experiment with them a little bit, and when you're ready, move on to the next movie where we'll take a look at file permissions. In this movie, I want us to start to understand file permissions, or more specifically, who has what permission to access, read, and write our files and directories. Now, permissions can be a very thorny issue, and they require a lot of tinkering to get things exactly right. It's a big enough subject that I actually recommend that you go off and research it further on your own, but I'll at least give you an introduction to get you started on the right path. Now, one of the reasons why we want to use file permissions is because of the security that they provide. They give an extra layer of security that ensures that people on the web cannot access files and folders that we don't want them to. And once we put our website into production, put it out for the public to use, we want to be constantly vigilant about exposing our website to hacking. One tip that I'll give you is that it's always a good idea, if you're going to have files be uploaded, that you upload them into their own special separate directory, separate from the rest of your code, because then we can make the permissions on that folder looser, and we can say you are allowed to write to this directory. But some of our other directories can be a little bit tighter in their security. We can say, no, you aren't allowed to write anything to these directories, and that way we can make sure that people don't change our files or modify our code. In general, you want to grant as few permissions as it takes to get the job done. Now that's once we're in production, once we've launched it to the public. For now, we're in development. We're on our own machine and we don't need to worry about hacking. So we can have our permissions be wide open. But it's still going to be important for us to understand file permissions to make sure that we're allowed to do the things that we want to be able to do on our development machine, that permissions don't get in our way. And that's what we'll be looking at now. Now, most of the way PHP is going to handle permissions is going to be the way that Unix handles them. So I need to say a word first about Windows and how Windows file permissions works. It's a little bit easier and it's a little bit harder. The reason it's easier is because it's going to simply manage through the Properties Security tab. So you'll go to Properties for a file, click on the Security tab, and then you can manage the permissions for that file. If you can't see the Security tab, you may need to enable that feature first. Now, the default permissions that Windows has may work. In general, it tends to be wide open, and so you probably won't run into any problems. The other reason it's easier is because the security model for Windows is much simpler. You basically are a user who either has access or doesn't have access. Now, it's a little bit harder, though, because different versions of Windows handle it slightly differently, and the way that the properties and the security tab work are a little bit different. And this chapter will also present a little bit of a problem for you if you're a Windows user, because many of the PHP methods that we're going to be talking about are either going to be fully ignored or partially ignored. So Windows users, default permissions may work, and you may not need this chapter at all. But I think it is still useful for you to understand in case you deploy to a different environment later. PHP, remember, is not platform specific. So now let's talk about the way that Mac OS X, Unix, and Linux do their file permissions, because they're all done the same way. Basically, we have three categories of users that could be coming to our file. We have user, which is us, the person who created the file, the owner of the file. There's group, which is a group of users, and we can assign people to groups. And then there's other, which is everybody, the public at large. So it's not us, it's not someone in one of our trusted groups, it's just other. And we have three types of actions that we can do to a file or even to a folder, and that is to read it, to write to it, or execute it. And in the case of folders or directories, execute actually means list the contents of what's in the directory. But since we're mostly interested in files, we're talking about being able to run executable files. So let's suppose that we have an imaginary file, and we want to grant permissions to user, group, and other that look something like this. We want our user to be able to read, write, and execute a file. Group can read and write it, but not execute it, and other can read it, but not write it. This is just a real simple example meant to show you how we can have different permissions for the different categories. You'll notice that I have those abbreviations, R, W, and X, next to read, write, and execute. That's because those are the abbreviations we use when we summarize these listings. So for user, if we can both read, write, and execute, it gets R, W, and X. And group, you'll see it gets R and W, and then just a minus sign in place of the execute. Other is the same thing, but with only the R and then 2 dashes. We call this symbolic notation, and you'll see it from the command line inside Unix, Linux, or Mac OS X. Usually they're all run together, and they're in that same order, user, group, and other. Now, there's another kind of notation that you need to know about, which is called octal notation. Now, in order to get from octal notation to symbolic notation, you're going to need to do a conversion. And the key for conversion is what I've got there. R equals 4, W equals 2, X equals 1, and the dash equals 0. So then, with that key in mind, we can take RWX and convert it to 7. And RW would just be R plus W, so that would be 4 plus 2, 6. And R by itself would be 4. Now we have a shorthand for being able to talk about that whole string of letters up at the top. And that's called octal notation. So 7, 6, and 4 represents the exact same thing as the symbolic notation RWX, RW R dash. So 764 is a lot easier. Once you do a lot of these file permissions, you'll start to get familiar with them. 777 means let everyone have access. 000 means let no one have access. 666 means let everyone read and write it, but not execute it. So you start to get the idea. So before we move on to actually demonstrate this from the command line, I want to talk about one more concept, which is who am I? Now, that sounds very metaphysical. What I actually mean is, who is the web server? We saw from the file permissions that there's an owner of these files. So we have to know who the owner of the file is, and then know who the web server is to know whether the web server has access or not. Now, often, you'll find that the answer to who am I is nobody. That sounds like a Zen answer, but in fact, that is a valid user on a lot of Linux systems, is nobody. Sometimes, though, instead it'll be www or Apache. And I'll show you a way that might help you to determine which one of these your web server is running as. So here I am at the command line, and I'm already navigated inside my B2B sandbox folder so that we can look at the files that are there. Now, the first thing I want to show you is that if we type ls, it'll give us a listing of all our files. If we type ls-la, it'll give us a listing of all our files with their permission information. So you'll see now in this list the symbolic notation that we were just talking about. So for example, in parent.php, we have read and write permission, but not execute for the owner of the file. And then we have the group set to be able to read it, and everyone can read it as well. Now we also can find out who the owner of that file is. That's given right here. That's the first column where it says Kevin. So I'm the owner of the file. Yours will obviously say something different. And the group information is the second column there. What group owns this file? What group has access to it? Now, we're not going to be talking a lot about groups, but the concept is very simple. If we were to take users and put them into a group, we could then assign ownership of a file to a group, and then everyone who's in that group would have those access permissions. For now, we're just going to be working with user and focusing on the user having access. So we asked who am I earlier. My web server is most certainly not Kevin. Now, it might be part of the staff group, but I don't think it is. So the question is, what access then does my web server have to parent.php? It's not the user, it's not the group, so it would be other. So in this case, it would have read access. If we wanted to modify those permissions, which we'll see how to do in a bit, then we would need to change it for other so that other would have different permissions. Now, I've told you that I would also give you a trick that might help you to identify which user Apache is running as. If we run the command psaux, that will give us information about the processes that are currently running. If we then put a space and the upright pipe, so that's just a straight up and down bar, space, grep, and then httpd. That will look for the web server process that's running. It will usually be called httpd. And if we do that, it will search for lines that contain that. And you'll see that we got a couple back. This is the important one here, which is that I have my web server running as www. You can ignore the underscore that's in front of it. What's important is that www. That is the user that my web server is running as. So now that we understand the fundamentals of users and permissions, in the next movie, let's look at how we can actually change the users and the permissions on a file. Now that we understand the fundamentals of file permissions, let's talk about how to change those file permissions from the command line. And we're going to be making use of two Unix commands, chown and chmod. So those are the ones we're going to be using to change the ownership and to change the permissions. Let's see them at work. So here I am at the command line where we left off before. I'm still inside B2B Sandbox. I'm also just going to real quick go into the sandbox and create a new file that we can use to work with here and not mess up our other files. So I'll open up TextMate and open a new file, and I'll just say this is a file for testing file permissions. And then I'll save it in that B2B Sandbox folder, and we'll call it file underscore permissions.php. And it doesn't actually have any PHP in it, but just to keep it the same as the other files, we'll give it that extension. So here's file permissions.php. We see it right there. Let's do our ls-la trick again to do a list. And we'll now see file permissions.php shows up here. And we can see it has the same permissions, read and write for the owner, which is me, Kevin. And for both the group and other, it has the ability to read the file, which allows our web server to read it, which allows it then to serve up what's in the file. Now, just to be clear, when we talk about executing a file, that's not executing it on the web server. All the web server has to do is be able to read in the script, and it will do whatever's in the script. When we talk about executing, we're talking about having more of a .exe file or something that we can actually run from the command line. Execute's not going to play a big part when we're working with the web server. Either we can read or write a file, or we can't. You'll remember from the last movie, I was able to find out that my Apache was running as www. And that may be true for you. It also may be nobody or Apache or something else. I'm going to go ahead and just show you how to change file permissions to have a different owner. And I'm going to do that with that chown command. But before I do that, I'm going to type in sudo. Now, you may have used sudo a few times in the past and not really known what it did. It basically says, do this command with the highest level permissions that the system has. So if I'm allowed to be a sudo person, if I'm allowed to have that super user ability, that's what the SU stands for, super user, then I will have those super user permissions. So with top level permissions, try to change the owner to www for file permissions.php. And it came back, it didn't give me any response, it just did it. If I type ls-la though, we'll now see that it has changed the owner to www. So now that the ownership has changed, www has read and write permissions, Kevin just has read permissions. So we've changed who is the user for this file. Now we can do the same thing to change permissions. We can say sudo and then chmod, and then we're going to pass in the permissions that we want. And there are a number of different ways we can do that. We can use the symbolic notation that we saw before, that R, W, and X, but I'm going to do it with the octal notation that we talked about. I'm going to go ahead and for now just say 777, so you'll see what it does with file permissions.php. All right, now let's do ls-la and see that again. And notice now that 777 opened it wide up so that everybody can read, write, and execute. It doesn't matter who the owner is. Everybody has the ability to access this file. Now we can have something that's a little more locked down than that. I'll just simply change this to be 744. Actually, 644 is what we had before. I'll go back to that first. 644. And you'll see that now it's back to what it was. This is 6, this is 4, and this is 4. So now I've set it back to what it was. Let's try changing it so that Kevin doesn't have access anymore. So let's just say 600. Kevin might be part of staff. So let's go ahead and make sure that staff also doesn't have access. So it'll be 600. The www user will still have those read and write privileges. And now let's just try opening that file up. So I'll come back here into my file system. I'll double click on file permissions. You see it comes up blank. And if I type hello and hit save, it says, oh, it wants your password. So it won't let me do it because I don't have enough permissions and it doesn't allow me to see what's in there. So the important point that you need to take away from this is that in order for your PHP to work successfully, you need to make sure that the file is readable. Then the web server can read it in and do whatever it asks it to do. However, now that we're about to start doing uploading of files, we're also going to need to have directories that are writable so that we can actually write to them. And when we start doing things like log files, we're going to need them to be both readable and writable so that we can add entries to a log file and read back what's there as well. Now, in addition to being able to issue command line instructions like chown and chmod, we can do the same thing from inside PHP. And that's what we'll look at in the next movie. Now that we've seen how to manipulate file permissions from the command line, I want us to see how we can do that in PHP. Before we can get started on that, we first need to talk about something in PHP called safe mode. Back at the beginning of this title, we created a my_php info file that just simply brings up the PHP info script. And we can bring that up in a browser and take a look. So here we are at the main page for PHP info. If you do a search for safe mode, you'll see that it comes up and gives us safe mode for me is off. Now yours may say on. It's not so important whether it's on or off, is that you know how to change it and what it does. The way that you change it is you go into your php.ini file and you turn it on or off, and then you just restart your web server so that it reloads those new changes for PHP. That's how you turn it on and off. What safe mode does is that when safe mode is on, PHP checks to see if the owner of the current PHP script that's running matches the owner of the file that you want to manipulate. So if safe mode is on, we don't have the ability to manipulate files that we don't own. Now this is a feature that was added mostly for shared hosting environments. It's eventually going to go away in PHP. It's not strictly necessary for you to have it on, certainly in your development environment, and even in your production environment. But if you're going to be manipulating files that you don't own, you will need safe mode to be off. Now that we know about safe mode, let's create a file where we can start working with our PHP. So I'll open up TextMate and I'll make a new file, and I'm going to save it in my B2B sandbox, and I'm going to call it filechanger.php. Now that may sound like an odd name, but what I'm after here is that this file is going to be where we manipulate another file, and the other file we're going to manipulate is going to be file permissions, the one we were working with from the last movie. So file changer will be the currently running script. File permissions will be the one that we're going to manipulate. Let's take a look from the terminal. Remember I said you could do ls-la. I'm also going to use that upright pipe followed by grep and then file underscore. This will come back and just give me the lines that are related to file underscore in the name. So we can see the basics file. We're not interested in that one, but we can see changer and we can see permissions. Now for me, changer is owned by Kevin. www, though, owns file permissions because we changed it to be that. You may have changed it back or it may be something else. So if we have safe mode on, file changer will not be able to make any changes to file permissions because they have different owners. It doesn't matter what permissions are set over here. Even if we're allowed to execute things, PHP will intervene and say, sorry, I'm not going to let you do that. Instead, I think it's better to have safe mode off, and then we can control which things we allow PHP to do by using the file permissions. So to start with, let's take a look at the file owner function. So file owner, and this will tell us the owner of a file. And we're going to say file permissions.php. That's the file that we want to look at. Now notice here I just provided simply a string with the file name. It's going to assume it's in the same directory. If it was somewhere else, I could say ... back to get it to go back a directory, or I could use an absolute path. We saw how to do that with file plus and so on. But it's going to just assume it's in the same directory. So let's bring this up in a browser and see what we get if we ask for just the file owner. So here we are with file permissions, and I now want to run file changer. It came back with 70. Now that's not particularly useful. It didn't give me www. Instead, what it gave me was the ID of the user, because that's what is stored there, and that's what's easiest for it to find. Now we can compare IDs between this file and a different file, but in order to find out the name, it's a little bit trickier. And what we're going to need to do is make use of a library that is probably not installed on Windows and even may not be installed on a Linux, Unix, or Mac machine. It's called the Posix Library. So if we have Posix installed, then we can do it a little bit differently. Instead, we can say that the owner ID is equal to this, and then we'll pull back an owner array by saying Posix get PWUID. That'll get the user ID from the password file for the owner ID. So look it up for us. And then once we get that array of information back about the owner, then we'll pull out the part that we want, owner array, just the name. And you can take a look at the full array if you want to see what else it gives you. So let's try that now. We'll go back to Firefox, we'll reload it, and you'll see we get the www. I'll go ahead and just put in echo br, just so that we have a nice break there. Now that we have the owner name, we might want to now change the owner. For example, from www to Kevin, or to your name. So we saw to do that before with chown. We still have chown available to us in PHP, but it's going to be so problematic, it's basically unusable. I'll show you why. We first need to provide the file name that we want to change the ownership of, and then we need to provide the new owner name. So for me, I'm going to put in Kevin. You can put in your name, whatever you had before, or a different user. Nobody is also probably a user you could use. So I'll save it. Now, before I try this in a web browser, Let's go ahead then and do this same echo statement back again, just so we can see who the owner is after we've done the ch7 statement. Now, keep in mind before I run this, that safe mode is off for me. So that's not stopping us from making this change. And you'll remember, if we look back at the terminal, that this file is set to both read and write for anyone. So read and write is not the issue. It's not a permissions problem. So let's now switch back over to Firefox and let's try it out. FileChanger.php, and it comes up and it says, warning, operation not permitted. Now, the reason why it's not permitted, you can see in the documentation for ch7 on the php.net website. It attempts to change the owner of the file, but only the superuser may change the owner of a file. That's a pretty big restriction. You remember when we did ch7 from the command line, we typed in sudo. That made us temporarily the superuser, so that we had superuser privileges. Well, PHP insists that we always have to be the superuser if we're going to change the owner of the file. That means that our web server has to be a superuser. Now that creates a pretty big security issue for us if we let our web server have those top-level access privileges. So for that reason, I don't recommend it. And I think that makes ch7 virtually unusable in PHP. So it does exist. You do have the ability to use it, but I don't recommend it. Instead, we're going to want to stick with chmod and changing the privileges so that the privileges allow the right person to access the right file. So let's switch back to our file changer, and I'm just going to make a note here that says ch7 only works if PHP is superuser, making web server /PHP a superuser is a big security issue. But unlike ch7, we can use chmod. So let's see how we can do that. First, let's see what the permissions are. So we'll say echo file perms for file permissions, and then we're going to use this same file. I'll just copy and paste file perms, and let's see what it gives us back. Let's go to Firefox, reload, and you'll see it gives us 33206. Now that doesn't translate to anything that we've talked about so far. Threes were not part of that code that we were using to change to octals, and this is not symbolic notation. What this is a decimal representation. So in order to make it usable, we need to use a simple function called DECOCT, which is basically convert from a decimal to an octal. So this is one of the only times you're going to use it, DECOCT, and surround it. Then we'll come back and we'll say, all right, Firefox, now give it to me. And it comes back and says 100666. Now the important part are these last four numbers. The last three is what we're used to seeing as an octal. The fourth one is also going to be something that PHP is going to want us to use. And in fact, if you really want to get just the important part, you can use substring function wrapped around there, comma 2, and then when we go back to Firefox, it'll return just those 4 characters of the file permissions. Now that we have that, let's try and use chmod to change it. So we're going to change it on filepermissions.php. And let's go ahead and say that the file permissions ought to be 777. Now there's one big change that we need here. We need to put that 0 in front of it. So PHP is always going to want to have that 0 in the first place. So 0 and then the octal number that we're used to using. So let's try that, and then after it's done, let's echo back the change so we'll see the difference. So now we'll switch back over to Firefox and we'll try it out. So we'll hit reload. It came back the same thing. Let's reload it one more time. There it goes. Now that we see the change took place. So the change of the permissions did take place. We just had to reload our page an extra time to be able to see them. Now, it's not very convenient to have to check this octal to figure out whether something is readable or writable to you. Instead, the better way to do it is to use is readable and is writable, and use those as tests for whether or not we can read or write to the file. So let's paste in the file name there. So is it readable or is it writable? It's a Boolean expression. So we want it to return yes or no. And I'll just put that down here as well. We'll need our semicolons, and we'll need to echo the value just so that we can see it. So that'll just give us a quick, is that file readable? Is that file writable? And let's just grab our BR tag here just so that it's nice and clean. All right, let's try that out. So is readable or is writable? Yes, it is readable and it is writable. And if we change this now to be something like 444, save it, Let's go back to Firefox, reload it. Yes, it is readable. No, it's not writable. Now, we didn't see the file permission change there. If we reload a second time, we'll actually see it. It had cached it. So it did right away know, though, whether it was readable or writable. So is writable are the methods that we'll use to find out if something is readable or writable, and we'll use chmod if we want to change the permissions. Now that we understand permissions and how to determine whether a file is readable or is writable, we're ready to actually do the reading and writing. And the first step in doing that is learning how to access files in PHP. The PHP function that we're going to be focusing on primarily is going to be fopen. So we're going to open up a file, we're going to provide the file name, and we're going to tell it what mode it should open it in. We'll talk about modes in a second. One important thing to note is that fopen opens up a file whether it exists or not. So it will create it if necessary. Now, just because it's called open doesn't mean that the file has to exist already. We can say fopen and provide a file name that doesn't exist, and assuming we've provided the right mode to it, it will create the file if it doesn't already exist. So it will either open the existing file or it will create a new one. The same command will work for both. So now let's talk about modes. The file access modes that we have the option of passing in are R, which is read from the start of the file. This is just reading only. And the file must exist, of course, if we're going to read from it. So that's going to be reading data in from a file that's already on our server. The second two are going to be our two write methods. The first one is going to erase anything that was in the file if it already existed, or create a new file if it didn't. But we're basically going to be starting with a blank file, and we're going to be at the beginning of the file, ready to start writing. And then the third one is append or write to the end. So that's going to be useful for something like a log file, where we just need to add one new entry and then exit the file. In that case, the W method would not have been suitable because it would have truncated everything that was there before, just wiped it out. Now there's a fourth mode that I want to mention to you, which we won't use a lot, but it's X. And that is write from the start and the file can't exist. So essentially what that does is keep us from accidentally overwriting another file. It says start writing a new file, but object if this file already exists. Do not overwrite it. Now all four of these modes also offer an alternative version. Instead of just R for reading from a file, what if we want to both read and write from the file while we're in there? Well, for that we have a plus version. So for the read, we can both read and write if we put the plus after it. For the W plus, it's going to truncate us, put us at the start, but then we can go ahead and read and write from there. And append will put us at the end of the file, but also enable us to both read and write from it. And the same is true for X. So those plus versions are the ones that let us move around in the file and read a little bit, write a little bit, and then keep moving on. If we're just going to be reading though, just going to be writing, we'll want to stick with the non-plus versions. Now, before we actually put fopen into practice, there's one more thing that I want to make sure I caution you about, which is file line endings. There's another difference between the two platforms, Windows and then Mac, Linux, and Unix, is the kind of line endings that end each line of a file. Windows uses /r/n. Now, you may say, well, I've never seen that in a file. A lot of times they get suppressed and hidden by your word processor or whatever you're looking at, but that's how it knows to wrap around, is that it has those characters in there, and then it just hides them from you and just goes ahead and moves to a new line. Well, Mac, Linux, and Unix use /n instead. So you can see how if we're reading in a file that has the wrong line endings, it might cause problems depending on which platform we're on. So there's an additional mode modifier that we can pass in, as well as the R, the W, and the A, and the X. And that is either T or B. Now, B is binary mode, which says basically don't translate. Just take what I give you and write it to the file without making any changes. And B has been the default on all platforms since PHP 4.3.2. Before that, it depends on exactly which platform you were on, which version of PHP. You couldn't really be sure. But for a while now, it's been standardized on B. Now, T is really for use by Windows users. If you need to use Windows line endings when you're writing a file, so that, let's say, another Windows application can open it up later, you'll want to use the T modifier. And that will then make sure that everywhere you've said /n in your PHP script, it will quietly just put down /r/n for you so that it's ready for your Windows application. Now, the same thing, if a file was created originally in a Windows application, you can use T to translate and make sure you get those correct line endings. So I just want to make sure that I at least tell you about that, so that if you're having problems on Windows with having the wrong line endings, you'll know what the solution is. Now let's get some experience using fopen. So I'm going to open up TextMate, and let's create a new file, and I'm going to save it in my B2B sandbox as file access.php. In this file, we're just going to concentrate on getting access worked out. So we already talked about the fact that it was going to be fopen that we would be using. So let's specify the file name, and let's just call it filetest.txt. Just a nice simple name. So then we're going to want to pass that file name in to fopen. Then we're going to need to pass in the modifier. So in this case, we're going to create a new file called filetest and write to it. So I'm going to use W. If I'd used R, it would fail because filetest doesn't exist. But here's also where I could pass in a B or a T if I wanted to add those additional modifiers, or a plus. But for now, I'm just going to be using the W. And fopen also returns a handle as a value. Now, you remember we talked about handles with the database connections. When we did a database connection to MySQL, it returned a handle, and the reason why that handle was useful was because then we could close it. And that's exactly what we're going to do here as well. We're going to close our file by referencing its handle. So that's just a reference to the file that we've opened so that we can continue to talk about it after it's open. Now, it's a good practice to always close your files. PHP will close all files at the end of the code execution on its own, just like it closes the database connections. But you want to close them yourself so that you don't accidentally write to the file again when you don't mean to. It's just good practice. If you're opening up the file, let's go ahead and close it when we're done. If we need to reopen it, we can reopen it, and so on. So let's go ahead and try this, and it's going to give us some problems, but they'll illustrate a couple of points that I want to make. So I'm just going to save file access, and I'll open up Firefox, and we'll go to localhost B2B sandbox, and it'll be file access.php that will load up. Now, instead of working, it gave us an error saying that fopen failed to open stream. That means it failed to open the file. The stream is just the data stream where it's going to write to the file. So the permission was denied is the error. Why? And so therefore fclose couldn't work because it had an invalid resource because we never opened it up. So this raises one issue that I want to jump to right away, which is that it's always a good idea, I think, to bracket this inside if statements. So we say if the handle succeeds, then what do we want to do? And in this case, we'll just simply close it. That's all we want to do. If not, then we'll just have something like echo could not open file for writing. So I think that's a really good habit to be in because it's going to prevent some of what happened here. Now if I do it, say I could not open file for writing, I get something that's a little more meaningful. Now I'm still getting my errors because I'm in development mode and I told my PHP file to show that to me. But in production, I would still be able to see something like could not open file for writing. And we could also take a different action here if we wanted to. But now let's deal with this permissions issue and actually fix what's going on here where it says permission denied. Now, if it did work for you, then that's great. But if it didn't, like for me, and I'm guessing it probably didn't, you'll need to go to your terminal, and in that B2B sandbox file, we need to see what the permissions are for the directory that we're trying to create this file in. We talked about permissions. So I'm going to scroll up here at the top. This is the current directory we're in. It's the period. ... is the directory one back from here. Period is this directory that I'm in right now, B2B sandbox. These are its permissions. So you can see that as a user, Kevin, I have the ability to read and write files to it. But the web server, which is not running as Kevin, it's running as www, does not have enough privileges to write. It can only read from these files. So we need to give it privileges on this directory so that it can do that. And you remember how to do that. I don't think I need to tell you, but we'll do it together. Sudo chmod, and we'll go ahead and just make it 777, so it'll open it wide up. Now you also could change the owner if you wanted. I'm just going to open it wide up so that this directory now is fully able to be read and written to or executed anything that's in it. And the way I talk about this directory is I could either navigate back a directory and then say, okay, the B2B sandbox file, or I can just use that period, and that'll say this directory that I'm in right now. And it wants my password because I did a sudo. And then let's just do ls-la one more time. We'll take a look back up here, and sure enough, this directory now has rwx, rwx, rwx. So now it is a writable directory. Let's switch back and let's just try our file access again. And there it is. It worked fine. If we come back over here and take a look, we should have gotten filetest.txt, and there it is. It created it. So it's important, I think, to use that if-then statement. It's important to always close your files and you want to make sure that any file that you're going to try and write to is going to be writable. So you just need to make sure that the file itself is readable. But in the case of writing, we need to make sure that the directory we're going to write to has permission to write to it. In the next movie, we'll take a look at how we can actually write content into the file test. In this movie, I'm going to show you how to actually write data to the files now that we know how to access them. And once you have the accessing down, writing to them is dead simple. Now this is the file access.php file I was working with. I'm just going to save it as a new file just so we can keep track of the different stages that we're working on. So I'm just going to do save as, and instead of file access, I'm going to call it file write. There we go. Now I have the other one saved to refer back to, and we can go ahead and make changes here. So I'm still going to work with the W mode. I'm just going to make a note here that this is going to overwrite anything that was there before, just so that I remember. And we already have the close. What we need to do now is actually write to the file. And it's super simple. It's just fwrite, and then the handle, and then whatever we want to write, ABC. And just to make a note here, that's going to return the number of bytes that were written or false. And it's up to us whether we want to capture that or not. We could also, make it an if-then statement if we wanted to check and see whether it succeeded or not. Generally, if you can open the file, writing goes ahead and takes place. So there's no real reason that we need to capture that data. We usually just go ahead and write the data and then close it when we're done. So let's go ahead and give this a shot. Let's open up our web browser. And this one is going to be called File Write. So there it ran. We didn't get any data there. We haven't learned how to read from the file yet. So instead, we're just going to come over here to filetest.txt and open it up. And there's our ABC. So there it is. It did go in. So if we wanted to write more to it, we could do the same thing. Let's say fwrite, and then the handle again. And this time we're going to pass in 1, 2, 3. So we'll save it. Again, we're going to be overwriting that file that was there. Let's hit return. We'll open it up. File test. Now it has ABC 1, 2, 3. So you'll notice that when we issue another write statement, it just picks up where it left off. And that's going to introduce us to this idea of the pointer. It works like a cursor. So while this file is open, it puts the pointer at the beginning of the file, and now it's waiting for us to type. And when you do an fwrite, it types ABC for us. And then the pointer is sitting there right after the C, just like a cursor blinking. And then when we say fwrite again, it writes the next bit of text. So keep that idea of the cursor or the pointer in mind, because we'll be looking at it again in a moment. Now, more often than not, I would say that you typically construct all of the content that you want to output. So let's say 1, 2, 3, and then we'll put in a new line, 4, 5, 6. There we go. And then we'll simply just say, all right, after we've got all our content put together, pushed into a variable with all the line breaks, then we just do write. And we probably wouldn't even have a first one here. We would just simply construct everything and then say write it to the file, close the file. So that's a more common way to work. I wanted to show you this also with the line endings because it raises another point, which is that double quotes matter with, I'm going to say /n, but it's really with any of those special control characters. Single quotes will put in a literal /n, but the double quotes say, be aware when you're looking at this string that there might be some special characters like line returns. So the double quotes are important. So I'm going to save that, and let's go ahead and just to prove to ourselves that it worked one last time, we'll do file write, and then we'll go back and open up file test, and there it is, ABC 1, 2, 3, and then 4, 5, 6 on a new line. Now there's one thing I want to caution you about here, is that you might be tempted at some point to do something like a chmod. Let's say chmod and then the handle. And then let's say 0777, and that would make the file readable, writable, and so on. Well, be careful with this because the handle does not work with chmod. The handle only works with these that begin with F. Fwrite, fopen, fclose. Those are the ones that use the handle. This wants the actual file name. So in that case, this would actually change it to the right permissions. So just be careful with that the handle is not universally used. It's only really in these simple cases. Now, if all of that seems a little bit laborious to go through the process of every time writing a line and the handle and everything, there's also a shortcut. So I'll just show you. It's called file put contents. So we have a file. I have the contents all here together in a single string. Then I can use file put contents, pass in the file name, pass in the contents, and it's a shortcut for opening the file, writing the contents, and closing it. Now that's going to overwrite by default, so be very careful because it's going to just blow away anything that was there before with this new stuff. And I went ahead and captured the size of what it wrote just so that I could echo it back just to show you how that works. So let's try it. It's going to do the first writing at the top, and then it'll do the file put contents. We can just see the difference. So there we are. A file of 11 bytes was created. And if we open up file test now, you'll see it only has this 111.222.333, which was what I wrote here in this content. All of this got wiped away. So this is the shortcut for doing all of those steps. If you're just simply going to write a whole file, you can use this instead of going through all of those steps. In the next movie, we'll take a look at how we can delete files. We've seen how to create and write to files. Now I want us to see how we can delete files. Deleting is super simple as long as we keep two things in mind. First, we need to close files that we want to delete first. We can't delete open files. So we have to have that F close on any file we want to delete. So if we've opened it, we have to close it. If we never opened it, it's not an issue. It's already assumed to be closed. Second, we must make sure that we have write permission on the directory or the folder that contains the file. So in the same way we had to make sure that that directory was writable before we could create the file, we have to also make sure that it's writable before we can delete the file. Now in our case, that's already going to be true, but I wanted to mention it because it can be a little counterintuitive because you may think, oh, well, I have write permissions on the file itself. I ought to be able to delete it, but it's actually the directory that contains it where it makes a difference as well. So just keep that in mind. In order to test it out, we'll delete the file test.txt that we created earlier. We'll open a new TextMate file, and we'll go ahead and just save it as file delete.php. And we'll put some PHP tags in there. Now, deleting it is as simple as this one command, unlink. Now, I know unlink may not sound like what it's doing is deleting it. That's how you do it. The same way you unset a variable, we unlink a file. So we'll save that, and let's just try it out. And let's get rid of that file test. We can always create it again if we needed to. We'll go into Firefox and file delete. There it is. Let's take a look and see. And our test file is now gone. It's not there anymore. So as long as you keep those two caveats in mind, deleting files is super simple. In the next movie, we'll talk more about this idea of the file pointer and how we can move the cursor around inside of our file. You'll remember back from the movie where we learned to write to files that I talked about the idea of the file pointer, or it's like a cursor in a word processor that we can type and then it's cursor sitting there waiting for us to type some more. Well, like a cursor in our word processor, we also have the ability to move that pointer around inside the file, to write to different places within the file. And that's what we're going to see how to do in this movie. So let's open up a new file in TextMate, and I'll go ahead and save it as file pointer.php. And the first thing we'll need to do is the same kind of create file and write to a file that we've done before. Nothing really that special there. So in order to find out where our pointer is right now after we've done this writing, we can use ftell. And we'll pass in the handle again, and that will return the position. So I'll just call it POS. That's the position of our cursor or our pointer after having typed the 789 there. So now we can use that as a reference for moving around. And we can do that with fseek. Now we're not doing a search. What we're telling it is move to this new location, seek this new location for us. So handle, and then we also need to tell it what position it's going to go to. So let's say POS, and let's just say -6. So it'll take the current position -6, so it'll move back 6 characters. And once we do that, then we can write something else. I'll just put in ABCDEF. It's so common that we want to go back to the beginning of the file. We also have rewind available to us, and just pass in the handle and it will rewind back to the beginning of the file. And let's just put in something else here, XYZ. So let's go ahead and just try this and see what happens. So what we're doing is we're writing a little bit to the file, finding out the cursor position, moving back 6 characters, typing something else, going back to the beginning of the file and putting in something else, and then closing the file. So let's try it. Let's go back to Firefox, and you'll remember that this is going to actually create the file for us. We deleted it in the last movie, but it will create a new file called filetest.txt. And if we open it up, look what we get. We did get the moved around text, but notice that it overwrote what was there. So just to be very clear, this has nothing to do with what mode we put it in. It's not because we're in W mode, or if we had done X or A or anything like that. This is the behavior. When we move around the pointer, that cursor will overtype. So if we want to capture what was there, we have to first read that data in, hold it in a variable, and then re-output it at the end. So if we really wanted to put XYZ at the beginning and not destroy what was there, then we have to capture it, put this in, and then re-output what was there before. So that's the first thing that I want to caution you about. So beware, it will overtype. Okay, so that will remind us about that. The second thing that I want to point out to you is that those modes do matter a little bit, because the A and the A+ modes, the append modes, will not let us move the pointer. They put it at the end of the file and they force it to stay at the end of the file. They force us to append. The R and the W's are the ones that allow us to move around and read and write from different places. So if we want to be able to append, but then we might also want to jump back to the beginning, we need to use something like R+ as one of our options. And then we can go to the end of the file, write something, jump back to the beginning, and write something else. So those are just the two things that you need to be careful of. But with that, ftell, fseek, and rewind, you'll be able to move around to different points in your file and write data. Now typically we're only going to want to write it either at the beginning or at the end, or just write the whole file. But at least now you know how to move that pointer around and the way the pointer works. In the next movie, we'll take a look at how we can read back data that was previously written to a file. Now that we've seen how to write files and how to move the file pointer around, we're ready to learn how to read back information from files. So to start us out, I want to open up filewrite.php just so we have that as a reference for the steps that we used to write a file, because it's going to be very similar. And then I'm going to also open a new PHP document, and I'll save that in my sandbox, and I'll just call it fileread.php. So just like before, we have our PHP tags, and let's go ahead and specify the file we want. We'll have it be the same thing, file test again. Opening the file is going to be pretty much the same thing, except that instead of overwriting, now we want to read, and that's that R option. So we'll open it up. I'll go ahead and close my curly braces so I don't forget. And then inside here, we need to actually do the reading. And just like we used fwrite over here, we're going to have something similar. We're going to have fread that we'll read back in. So we'll pass in the file handle that we created. And the other option that we need to pass in as an argument for fread is how many bytes do we want it to read? I'm just going to say 3 for now. And then I'll just make a note here that each character is 1 byte. Now that's true in typical English language. We have 1 byte characters. In something like Chinese, it's multi-byte characters. So it is not necessarily true. But for the English language with the typical Roman alphabet, each character is going to be 1 byte long. And then the other thing, of course, we need to do is we don't want to just read it. We want to do something with that read. Now, we could just echo it out. That's perfectly valid. But I'm going to go ahead and just capture it in a variable, content. And then we want to, of course, make sure that we do our fclose that we normally do to close up the file once we're done with it. So now we've read 3 bytes in, or 3 characters, and we've assigned them to content. So in order to take a look at that, we could just simply put in echo content, and we'll be able to see those results back. Let's try that out. So we'll go into Firefox, localhost B2B sandbox, and we'll open up file read.php. And sure enough, it comes back with XYZ. And I'll just move this out of the way so we can bring up file test.txt. Yours might have something different. For me, it brought back these 3 characters, those 3 bytes. If we were to bring back more, let's say we brought back 6 characters, close that up, Firefox, reload the page, you'll notice that it all comes through as 1 line. It didn't break to a new line. That new line character is actually in there as part of the output. What we need to do in that case is to actually use the nl2br tag. And that is basically saying that we're going to take h new line and turn it into a br tag so that HTML will show it properly. And now we can see the break as we would expect. So instead of just getting this, we end up getting the 2-line version. Now, I'm sure you're wondering, what about if we don't know how many bytes a file is? We want to still be able to, let's say, read in an entire file regardless of how long it is. Well, with that, we can use file size. So fread handle, and then we'll ask the file, tell me what your file size is. How many bytes are you? And so file size comes in useful by telling us the total number of bytes. We will now read the file until we get to that total number of bytes. Then we'll know we have everything. And then we can do the same echo back. And let's go ahead and put in the nl2br. We'll try that out. And now we get in the entire file. Now, back over here on the file writing, we had file put contents, and that was a shortcut for us that would do the open, the writing, and the close. Well, we have the same kind of thing that we can do for reading, and that is file get contents. So we say, get the contents of this file, get everything there is. It takes care of file size and all that for us, reads to the end of the file, and then we have the ability to just echo that back. If we switch back over to Firefox and we reload the page, you'll see that it did. I didn't put the NL2BR there, but we know what that does. Now, the last thing that I want to make sure that I show you is incremental reading. Now, we've already seen how we can do incremental reading by reading a few bytes, but another thing that's really useful is to be able to read one line at a time. So, for example, if we had tab delimited data, so we're looking at an export that's been done of attendees or products, something like that, we could take that value and we could look for the first name, the last name, and everything as we parse through each line, and each one has a line return at the end, so it comes back. So we obviously want to just get a line, essentially. And in order to do that, what we use is fgets, content equals fgets handle. And that will then get one line of the file, and that's the maximum amount that it will retrieve. Now, obviously, in a case like this, we're going to want to not just get one line back, perhaps, but still go through and get the entire file. And the way we can also do that is by using while statement, while not f for file, EOF for end of file. So while we're not at the end of the file, and we need to pass it the handle again so that it knows which file we're talking about, then go through and perform this loop. There we go. And of course, content then will need to be built up over time. We don't want to just keep replacing it. And we know how we could do that with something like append. So content starts out being equal to an empty string, and each time we'll add each line to it. Now, obviously, for doing something like this, we'd probably want to do some processing to it. We'd probably want to get this value, then parse it, then work with it, then store it to content. But what I wanted to just make sure that you saw was how this FEOF works, so that we can say loop through until you get to the end of the file. It essentially does the same thing as this file size does, but instead of providing a number of bytes, it says just keep getting a line, keep getting a line, keep getting a line. If you hit the end of the file, then stop whatever you're doing. And that's all we need to be able to read in files. We'll go back over and just try it one more time here. We didn't actually output anything here at the end. Let's just do that one last time so that we can see that that worked too. There we go. And there we are. So now we know how to both successfully write files and how to read from them. In the next movie, we'll take a look at how we can examine some of the file details. To round out our discussion about files, in this movie I want us to take a look at how we can get some of the information about the file details. We've already seen file size. We're going to look at meta information that we can get about each file. So we'll go to TextMate and we'll just open up a new window, and I'll save it as file details.php, and that's in my B2B sandbox. And we'll start our PHP tags. And to start us off, let's go ahead and just put in file size, just so that we remember how to do that. So that's just simply the file size, and then we pass it in the file name. That'll echo it back to us. And then the next one that I want us to look at are the modification times about files. And there's actually more than just one number associated with this. There's actually 3 different ones. And we're going to get them using file M time, file C time, and file A time. Just put little colons after that to clean that up a little bit. The file M time is the last time that the content of the file was modified. So the file modification time. It's the content inside the file. We also have file C time. Some people mistakenly think that that's the creation time. That's not the case. It's the last changed time when the file was changed. We don't have access to the creation time. So it's the last changed time, and that's both changing the content or the metadata. The permissions, the owner, the group that it belongs to, all those sort of things that we learned how to do with chmod and chown. That includes those in file C time. And then last one is file A time. It actually keeps track of when a file was last accessed. So not only making those changes like we do with C time or M time, but in addition, anytime we read the file, anytime we read back the contents of the file, it updates that access time. So let's try all of those. Each one of them is going to take the file name as an argument, and it's going to return back a Unix timestamp. And we saw how we can use string for time right here, string ftime, and that will turn that timestamp into something that we can see. So let's just try that on this file name and see what we've got. Yours will almost certainly be different than mine, but you'll be able to see the difference between the times that your file was modified, created, or accessed. So I'll just open up Firefox, and let's go to file details.php. So there we go. The size came back as 11. That's the first one. And then my modification times were all the same. So my file at 12/10/2008 at 13:05 is when my file was changed and updated. Now, you may have different values or you may have the same value for all of those. One way that we can modify those times is with the touch command. So touch file name is going to say update those to the current time. We can also pass in some other additional arguments to tell it what time it should set it to. But what we're going to do for now is just say, set it to the current system time. Just sort of reach out and flip all of these times to be the current time. And then let's re-echo it just to see what time we get back. And we'll go back and we'll reload the page. Now just reload it once at first, okay? And notice what happens. So I hit reload. Now the times didn't change. The times are the same. If I reload it again, watch what happens though. They changed. The reason why is because there's some caching going on. These values are being stored the first time it goes and finds them, and touch does not change that. It does not flush the cache. So when we go here and we output it a second time, it's bringing up the cached values. So just because we touched it does not mean that we did not get the cached values back again. So we were getting old information at this point. It was outdated. When we reloaded the page, then we got the new times. So I just wanted to show you it by doing it twice so that you see that it is a cached value. And if you use touch, you may not get the right information here. You might be getting some old data back. So just to show you the difference, let's go in and actually open up filetest.txt and let's just make a change. Let's say GHI. There we go. And it's going to want me to put in my master password, and that's because I'm not the owner of the file. www is the owner. So that's why it came up and asked me for that. You may need to do the same kind of authentication, or you can do this with another file where you do still have permission to do it. So let's try that out now and just see, now that we've changed the content, everything changed. If we instead go through and do a read, let's wait 1 second. And after a good minute has passed, and you're pretty sure that a minute is over, we can do file read.php, and we'll read it. And then when we come back and do file details, oh, they're all still updated. Let's turn off our touch, first of all, so that it doesn't touch them anymore. Let a minute pass, then run read, and then you should see a difference. Now, I'm not going to wait a whole minute and have you sit here and wait with me, but you can do that and you'll see that the access time is different. And you can also try chmod and doing the chown and see the difference there and how that affects the different values. You might want to take off this touch the same way I did, just to make sure that you don't accidentally reset those values when you're trying to see the values change because of other actions you did. The last thing I want to show you about the file information that you can get back is path info. So I'm going to take just the current file that I'm in and ask for its path info, and it's going to return an array. I call it path parts, but it's an array of information that it gives back. And basically what it does is it takes the information about this file and parses it, puts all the pieces into an array that then we can retrieve. And so here's the things we can retrieve back. I can ask for its dir name. That's the directory name that it's in, and that will return the path all the way up to where the file is. Base name will give me the name of the file with its extension. File name, starting in PHP 5.2, will give me everything but the extension. And then, of course, I can ask for the extension just to get that part. So there's some variations you can look up on path name, some options we can pass to it, but this is essentially the way it works. It takes a file, parses its path into pieces, and then we can retrieve just those bits of information, and PHP knows how to do that for us. Let's just try that and make sure that it works fine. There we are. It gives us exactly what we'd expect. I think this pretty well rounds out our discussion about files, and we've learned how to write to files and how to read from files and how to change their permissions. Now we're ready to move on to talk about directories, and that's what we'll do starting in the next movie. Now that we've seen how we can work with files, let's spend a little bit of time exploring how to work with the directories that contain our files. We'll start by opening up a new text file, and I'm going to save that as file directories. And I'm going to still call it file just so that they stay grouped with the other examples we've been doing called file. So there we are. We'll put our PHP tags in to start. And now we're ready to talk about directories. Now we've already seen a couple of directory functions before. Dir name, we saw to get the name of a directory, and isdir. We were doing is something a directory or is it a file? I also want us to take a look at getCWD. CWD stands for current working directory. And it's a little bit like the file pointer that we have inside of a file as we're moving around in there. It keeps track of what directory we're in. Now, up until now, we've been just working with everything from absolute references. Every time we tell it what directory we're talking about, we give it the full path name. But we also have the ability to move around in the directory structure from this script. So while filedirectories.php is running, we'll have the abilities to change into a different directory, do some things, change to a different directory, do some more things there, so that we don't necessarily have to specify the full file path every time. Let's go ahead and bring this up and see our current working directory. And then in a moment, we'll actually create a new directory and we can practice moving into there. So file directories, and you'll see that it's just the current directory where file_directories.php is located. That is the current working directory. So let's try creating a directory. We do that with mkdir, short for make directory. So we can do make dir, and then we'll need to tell it the name of the directory. We'll call it new. And then we also need to tell it what permissions the directory should have. I'm going to say 0777, and that will tell it to make that directory sort of wide open for reading and writing and everything. And I'll also just make a note here that that is the PHP default. Now let's go ahead and try it, and let's take a look. Let's run our script again. So now if we come over here, we take a look. Here's our folder, new. And if we actually go to our command line, cd into sites for me, B2B, sandbox, ls-la, will give us a list of all of them, and we can see new. Now notice what happened here. It did not give it the permissions 777. So you're thinking, wait a minute, did I give you bad information? Did that not work right? Well, the reason why is that there's something called umask, and it is a mask that is applied to these permissions whenever a folder is created. And every system has its own default umask that is set. By default, it's set to be 0022, I believe, which means that it's going to subtract out 0, 2, and 2 from that 777, thus giving us 755. I'll just go ahead and make it here. Default may be 0022. So this umask gets applied. We can have the ability to use the umask function to change it. I'm not going to go into details on how to do that. You can also just use chmod, which we learned earlier, to change the permissions on this. But I wanted you to understand umask so that it doesn't stay a mystery to you as to why when you tell it, hey, create this with 777, it comes up with 755 for the permissions instead. I just wanted that to sort of be demystified so that you know how to change it if you need to. Now, the other thing that we can do is we can create directories recursively. Recursive dir creation. And we can do that with make dir. And I'm going to say new/test/test2. And we'll go ahead and say 0777. And then we pass in true. And true is for recursive or not. So this will create not only new, but go ahead and create test and test2. Everything that it needs to create all of those, all the way down the line. So if we're passing in more than just one, you'll want to also include that true statement there. So let's just try this real quick. I can go ahead and hide that. We'll run just our script again. So file exists on line 11. You'll see we got an error here for this make directory. So you can see that this does check whether it exists or not. So if we were using this in a real script, we would also want to check and make sure that this doesn't already exist before we tried to do the make dir. But for our purposes, just to learn how this works, we already know how file exist works. We saw that at the beginning of the file chapter. So for now, we can just go ahead and say make dir, and we'll just accept those errors. So let's take a look here inside new. There's test, and there's test2. So that's really all there is to it. Now let's try changing directories, and we can do that with chdir. So dir new, that will change into the new directory. And now if we say, tell us the working directory, we'll see what we get back there. Now we're going to get a couple of errors here because those directories already exist. That's all right. But you'll see that now our working directory is new. So at the beginning of our script, we'd created a new file and opened a file for writing. It would have been in the B2B sandbox folder. If we do our chdir and we move our working directory into new, now when we create a new file, it's going to be in the new folder because that's our working directory. It works a lot like a pointer. And then, of course, the very last thing that we want to learn how to do is to remove a directory and rmdir. So instead of mkdir for make directory, it's rm for remove the directory. And then we'll need to tell it what the directory is. Now, again, we'll want to make sure that the directory exists before we try and remove it. We know how to do that. I'm not going to do it here. Now, also notice that I moved my working directory here. I'm inside new. So this won't work. Let's try it just to see what happens. Let's do reload. And you'll see that I come back here with another error saying no such file or directory inside the folder that it's in now. So that's the current working directory. If I take away the new, since I've changed my working directory, now we come back and I don't get the warning. And if we take a look here, you'll see that test2 is now gone. Test still stays there. It just removed the directory at the end of that. The very last thing that I just want to mention to you is that in order to remove a directory, that it must be closed and empty before we can remove them. And there are some scripts that can help you figure out how to wipe out all directories that already have files by looking on the PHP website for rmdir. You can just do a search for it. But that will give you scripts that other people have written that will help you to recursively delete everything that's in an entire directory. Now that we know how to create and delete directories and how to move around in them, we're ready to look at the contents that are in those directories, because a lot of times what we want to do is find out, hey, what files are actually in this directory. We'll do that in the next movie. In the last movie, we saw how to create and move around in directories. Now let's see how to actually view the contents of those directories, the files or other directories that are contained inside. So for this movie, let's start out by creating a new file again, and we'll save it as file dir contents.php. And we'll create our PHP tags. The idea of working with a directory and reading from a directory is very similar to what we did with working with a file. It's a lot like fopen, fread, and fclose. We have open dir, read dir, and close dir. So the one thing that you'll want to do is make sure, of course, before you start trying to read from something, that it exists and that it is a directory. So here's a standard example of the process we would go through to output the contents of a directory. I'm going to have a directory, which I'm just going to use the current directory that I'm in right now. I'm just using the dot to signify that. That's my current working directory. We also saw how to use get cwd to get the same information. Then I'm going to check and see, is it a directory? If it is a directory, then we're going to use opendir, and we'll get a directory handle the same way that we got a file handle back. If we got that successfully, then while we're able to still get something back, while read directory returns something. So read directory will return the next item. So there's a pointer that moves through here. It works a lot like the fgets did. We were getting each line one by one. Well, this is getting each item in the directory one by one. And as long as it returns a file name, then it'll keep looping. And then we can do whatever we want with that file name. We can open up that file and look at it, inspect it, change its permissions. You know, we're inside a loop here. I'm just simply going to have it output the file name. Now notice it's a file name, not a file handle. We'd have to open the file if we want to have a file handle. So let's go ahead and just try that for now. Of course, the very last thing we'll want to make sure that we add after the loop is completely done is to close the directory. So if we're able to open it, then also let's make sure that we close it at the end. So let's open up Firefox and we'll look at file dir contents. And there we go. We get a list of all of the files. Now the file name is something I'm outputting. That's here, file name : and then the file name. So this lists all the files that are in that directory. Pretty neat, huh? Now notice that it included dot, which is the current directory, and dot, which is the directory one back from here, as well as .dsstore, which is a private file, a file that normally doesn't show up. If I come here to the terminal window, you can see those files are here as well. So the default listing for a directory is that it includes private files, it has a listing for itself, and it has a listing for its parent directory as well. Now, if we want to hide those, that's a simple matter for us. We just put an if-then statement, let's say, before we do this part of the loop. If the file name is a dot, then don't do anything. Or if it's ... don't do anything, and so on. So it's a simple matter of leaving those out if we want. But by default, those will also be in there. Now, I also want to point out that because it's a pointer that is moving through this file, so as we do each of these read directories, we're moving down to the next one. If we get to the end, or at any point we want to rewind and go back to the beginning, we have rewind dir, which allows us to jump back to the top of the file. So we could loop through the whole file, then we could rewind and loop through it again if we wanted. Maybe we're doing a table or something and we need to do one whole column and then rewind, do another whole column, and so on. Rewind dir would let us do that. It does have to happen, of course, before close directory because we need this directory handle. And once it's closed, the handle goes away. Now there is another way that we can do the same thing, and that is using scandir, SCAN, and then dir. And what it does is it takes all of those file names and puts them in an array. And then it's up to us if we want to take the array and go through and output it, which is what I've done here. You can see here that I've put in a little bit of code that will leave out those files that have a dot at the beginning of them. So this is essentially the same thing as if we had gone through this loop up here, but instead of outputting it, we had put each item into an array and built an array. Scan directory does that for us. It's a shortcut. Now, it's not a whole lot shorter, but it does make things like sorting and doing reverse order much easier. So if we wanted to do our directory in reverse order, we could read it all into an array, sort the array, and then output it in the order that we want. So that's where that's going to come in really useful. Let's try that out real quick. So I just did a refresh. Now it's doing the list twice here. Let me put in, I think it'll be a little easier to see, echo HR. There we are. Now we'll see where the one list stops and the other one starts. You'll see that the ... files are gone now. So it starts right here at the access modifiers. So that's done by this simple if-then statement here. I'm just searching for the position of that string in there to see whether or not it occurs at the 0 position or not. So that's really all there is to working with directories. We have the ability to create a directory. We have the ability to change directories and move around. We have the ability to see the contents of the directory. And then once we're able to pull in the contents, we can do things with it inside this loop here so that we can reach in the file, grab a bit of data, go to the next file, grab a bit of data, and so on. And we know how then to delete the directories when we're done with it. So I think the combination of working with both files and directories is going to be really powerful. In the next movie, I'm going to give you an assignment so that you can put all of this knowledge together and actually try it for yourself. Now that we understand the theory of how to work with files and directories, it's time to put it into practical use. And the way we're going to do that is by switching back to our photo gallery project. Remember, we've been working in the B2B sandbox. And in our photo gallery project, we're going to create a log file. Whenever an action takes place, we'll have the ability to call a function that will log a message to a simple text file. And then via PHP, we'll be able to read back in the results of that log file as well. So we'll be able to have a simple text file that has recorded actions. Now, these could be errors or something like that. In this case, we're going to be just working on logging when a user logs in. So every time a user logs in, we'll have a time and date that that user logged in to our log file. In this movie, I'm going to go over the requirements for this assignment and some of the steps that you're going to want to follow, but it's going to be up to you to go off on your own and do it, and to apply everything that you've learned to make this happen. And that's really where I think a lot of the learning is going to take place. So you want to make sure that you do this. And then I'll show you my solution afterwards. The first step is going to be to set up the log directory. So it's going to be in photo gallery /logs. Now, I believe we created that file earlier. You want to make sure that it does exist. And if it already exists, you'll also want to make sure that the web server is set as the owner. Remember, we talked about how the PHP scripts are not going to be able to make changes to directories that they don't own. So we'll want to make sure that that's the case, and you'll probably have to do that outside of PHP. We saw how to do that earlier, but just to remind you that from the command line, sudo chown www, if that's the name of your web server, and then the location of the file. And if you're in that directory, it's just logs. Otherwise, you might have to specify more of the path to find that file. But that'll get the log directory set up where we're ready to start creating files in it. Once you have your log directory set up, then we're ready to start looking at the requirements that you're going to need to meet for this exercise. The first is that we're going to need to code the log action. And we're going to do that in functions.php, and the function will be called log_action, and we'll give it 2 parameters. The action that we want to log, and then a message to go with it. So you'll want to write that PHP code to make that happen. So inside there, you're going to want to make sure that the file exists, and if it doesn't, you're going to want to create a new file. You're going to also want to make sure that the file is writable, and if not, then output an error. And when we add these entries, our log entries, we're going to want to append them to the end of the file. And there's a couple different ways you can do that. We saw an append method earlier. We also saw how we could move the pointer around to write at the end of a file. So I'll let you choose which one of those you want to try. The entries, go ahead and format like I've got there in the middle of the slide. Basically put the date and time, and then the action, in this case login, and then the message. In this case, it's Case Gogolin logged in. That's the username you'll have when the person logs in. And remember to make use of the constants we set up, site root and ds for the directory separator. And you'll want to consider how to handle new lines, because at the end of each line, of course, you're going to want to go to a new line. And remember that double quotes do matter for using those special characters like \n and \r. If you use single quotes, it'll just interpret them as being literal \n and r. In order to be a new line character, you need to use double quotes. Once you've done all that, and you've got the log action coded, try using it. Put it into admin login.php and see if you can actually log something to the file. Then you go into the log file, take a look, and see if it's there. If not, wipe it out, try again until you get it right. Now, in a lot of instances, it might be fine to just have that log file sitting there, and we could open it with a text editor whenever we want to see it. But we're also going to let our application read it in, because we know how to do that too. So the next step in our exercise will be to read back in the log file from a PHP page. Just like all the other admin pages, we're going to first confirm that the user is logged in already, because this is not something that non-logged in people should be able to do. And we're going to then locate that log file, and we're going to make sure we use site root and ds, the directory separator again. We're going to check if the file exists or not, check if it's readable or not, and then if it's readable, read its contents in. And we saw a couple ways to do that. I'll let you choose on how to do it. And then output those entries to HTML so that we can view them in the browser. And there are several ways that you can output those. We saw NL2BR for new line to BR tag. You can use that, or you can use cascading style sheets or an HTML table or something like that. But the overall idea is that we want to have all those entries show up in our HTML page. Once you've got those two parts together, I want you to round out the functionality of this log file by creating a way for us to clear the log file out. And so in that logfile.php, where we're viewing the file, we're also going to add a link that just says clear to log file, and it's going to request a URL logfile.php clear equals true. And then at the top of that same file, before we display the results of the file, we'll say, well, check and see. If clear is equal to true, then clear the logs. And then, after you've cleared them, we'll want to make another log entry that lets us know that the log was cleared. So you'll want to clear it out and put one entry in there letting you know that the logs were cleared. Now that's the end of your assignment that you need to go off and work on. And in the next movie, I'll show you the solution. You can peek at the solution if you run into problems, but even better would be for you to go back to the movies where we originally discussed those topics and see how to do it there, and then apply it and see if you can get it working. And as extra credit, if you get all of that working and you want to try something else, try creating a logger class. We've talked about classes, we've talked about files, we're going to now have seen how to work with a log file. You have everything you need to go ahead and bundle all of this information together into a logger class that we could then potentially use in all of our applications going forward. I'm not going to show you the solution to that, but that's just an extra exercise if you want to try it on your own. So give it a shot, and in the next movie, I'll show you my solutions. In this movie, I'm going to show you the solution that I came up with to the create a log file assignment. Now, if you haven't completed that assignment yet, I encourage you to try it on your own first. It's one of the best ways you're going to learn how to put all of these pieces together. And then once you have, you can review my solution and see how close we are. They may not be exact, and that's okay. There are a lot of different ways that you can approach these problems, but I'll show you mine. So the first requirement of the assignment was to make sure that we had a logs directory and to make sure that it was available to the web server. In this case, I made sure that the web server actually owns that file. www is my web server. Yours might be something else. The other way to approach it would be to set the permissions on that file to something different. Mine are set so that the owner has read and write privileges to it. Other people just have read privileges. We could change those, and if it wasn't the owner, then we certainly would need to make everyone, for example, be also read and write. But once we have the log file set up, then we're all set to move on to the second requirement. The second requirement was for us to code this log action inside functions.php. And you'll see that the first thing I did was I figured out where that log file ought to be. Even though it doesn't necessarily exist yet, where will it be? And I used site root and ds to say, well, it's in the logs directory, and it will be called log.txt. Now, the way I decided to write the file was using append. Now, append, one of its features is that if the file does not already exist, it will create it for you. If it does exist, it'll just grab it, open it up, and start appending at the end. Well, that's nice because it actually saves me from having to check whether the file exists or not. I went ahead and did a file exist check here and said, well, let's check and see if it's new. And the reason why is because once I'm done with all my writing, I decided to do a chmod at the end to say, well, make sure that the log file is 0755. Now, that's an optional step. You don't have to do those two steps. I went ahead and did it. Append has that functionality built in already where it will either create a new one or append to the end of the old one. So I open it up in append mode. So I'm all set. The pointer's at the end of the file, ready to write. I went ahead and figured out what my timestamp would be using the string ftime function, using just PHP's time. We saw how to do that earlier. And then I assembled the content that I wanted to output all together into a variable. And I said, we're going to put the timestamp, then a pipe, one of those upright bars, the action, colon, and then the message, and then new line at the end. Notice that, the \n, and that's in double quotes. Double quotes are important because we're using this special character. And then I write that content to the file, close the file, and we're all set. Now, of course, if it wouldn't open up for some reason, then we say just a simple error message, could not open it up. So that's all there is to writing the log action. And now we can call that action whenever we want. And here we'll do that in our login.php. We just simply say log action, and then login we'll call. And then what are we going to pass in? We'll pass in the username and the logged in as the message. And that's all there is to it. Now we can log things to the log file that easily. So that takes care of the second part of the assignment that I gave you, which was to write that log action and use it. And then the next thing we want to do is be able to read that log file back in. I went ahead and said where we should be able to find the log file. Now, since we have this in both places, potentially this could be something that we'd set up in our config so that we could look in our configuration and know where the log file is instead of having to repeat it several times throughout our code. But for now, this will do. Now we'll come back to the get clear part. That was the fourth part of the assignment. The third part is to read in that log file. So we know where the log file is. So down here in the HTML, I've got a bit of PHP that's going to check to see, does the file exist? Is it readable? And can we open it? So if all three of those things return true, then great, we can keep going. We're ready to read in the file. But if it doesn't exist, or if it's not readable, or if we have a problem opening it for any reason, we'll go down here to the else statement, could not read from the log file. Now, let's assume that it works. In most cases, it should. I decided to do it with some CSS. So I went ahead and had a UL just for an unordered list, and then each of the items I decided would be LIs. So it'll be a nice HTML list that we could potentially style then with style sheets. So here's the important part though. I do the loop until we get to the end of the file, while not equal to the end of the file, get each line. And I decided to use fgets. You could have used fread or something that would have been fine. The reason fgets works so well is because we know that each line in the log file has a new line return after it. We don't necessarily know how long it is, but we know that there's a new line. So fgets handles that for us. It says, get the next bit of information until you get to a new line. So for line-by-line files, fgets is the best way to go. And then I went ahead and added a little bit of text here, an if statement, before I actually output the entry. The reason I decided to do that was that this makes sure that there's not a new line return without something else there. And I discovered that I needed that when I started clearing the log file. Sometimes I would have an extra new line return, and I was getting an li tag with nothing in it. And I said, well, it would be a nice improvement here if I simply just trimmed any white space from entry. And if there is something there besides just nothing after we've trimmed away the white space, then output the entry. That's optional. And then the fourth part of the assignment was this clearing the log file. So I pretty much gave you what the link tag should be to make that happen. The part that you really need to code is up here. If get clear equals true, let me just expand this, and you'll see file put contents is what I decided to use. And I told the log file, put the contents, nothing in that file. So I wanted to use file put contents here so you could see a place where it's really useful. Remember, this is a shorthand way that we can write to the file. Now, I could have also opened up the file using overwrite and written in the file logs cleared. I decided to go ahead and do it with this one line, clear out the log file by putting nothing in it, and then add in that first log entry saying that the logs were cleared. And finally, I said redirect to. You'll see why that's true in a second when we try this out. It'll redirect to the same page so that the URL won't have clear equals true anymore in it. We'll see that in action. Let's take a look. So I'll go and open up a new Firefox window, and we'll go to localhost, photo gallery public, and then where I want to go is actually into admin login.php. And we'll try that out. Now I'm going to log in as K Skoglund with secret pwd. That was my password, secret pwd. Now I'm logged in. It should have logged that. Let's take a look at our log file, view log file. And sure enough, here we are. We've got some old logs there. We've got the new entry that I just created. And if I click create log file, it then clears out the logs and we start over again. Now I wanted to show you what I mean by that last redirect here. Let's take that out for a second. And let's just reload the page, log file, okay? And let's clear the log file. Now, because I didn't redirect, notice here that clear is equal to true. That might cause us to inadvertently clear the log file again. So by redirecting instead, I make sure that I clear out that parameter that was sent so that now, once we've cleared it, it's gone and it has to actually click the link in order to get that clearing effect again. So while that wasn't part of the assignment, that is just a good practice to be in, to keep track of what is up in that URL string, because that is something that the user could, reload the page, they could bookmark it. So if you don't want something sort of dangerous or destructive up in there, you want to make sure that you don't leave it up in there. So hopefully you got the same results and you got it working. If not, go back, rewind the movie, see what I did, try it on your own till you get it right. When you're ready, I'll meet you in the next chapter where we'll talk about uploading files via a web form.